in just a grain of sand. And they also, the signals that it sends can travel at over 250 miles per hour. That's pretty fast. Human brain can generate 23 watts of power, enough to power a light bulb. Also, brain's about 75% water, which makes sense. The rest of our body is pretty close to that. But, and if this is all that you take away from it, from this sermon, at least you'll get this out of it. That also means that if you're dehydrated, even a little bit, it can impact brain function. So if you don't want to be a dum-dum, stay hydrated. Speaking of that. So, brains are cool. They're also weird. So, it doesn't feel pain. There's no pain receptors in the brain, which is weird in itself. If you pinch yourself, you can feel it, but if I was to poke you in the brain with a stick, nothing. Sure, you might not be able to speak afterwards, but it won't hurt. Another weird thing. It's called phantom limb syndrome. If you were to have a leg, arm, whatever, amputated, your brain will still sometimes have the pain receptor and neurons and all that trigger for it to where you might feel pain, or you might have an itch that you just can't scratch because your leg is no longer there. That's weird. So another thing that you might have been told in school or something, that people are left brain or right brain. And that was a leading theory for a while, and it was almost true, but not really. So parts of your brain are better at other things. You see this list. So yes, your left brain is better at rational thought, and your right brain is better at emotional thought. But they both do the same thing. It's just one side is better at it than the other, except for in 3 areas. The left side can speak, and each side controls the opposite part of your body. So your right brain controls your left eye and left hand. Left brain, right eye, right hand. Make sense? No, it doesn't. But so we have that. So they're weirdly cool as well. Like that said, they both work. They both do everything except for the vision, the motor skills, and speech. You have this, the corpus callosum. It connects both sides. It's a bridge between the two, and it allows them to communicate between each other. And, that 100,000 neurons and all that, and all the signals sending across, they all go through the corpus callosum to allow both sides to communicate with each other. What happens if they're separated? We don't have to ask, we know. So, they're called split brain patients. In the 1950s, a treatment for severe epilepsy, where all the neurons and everything are going haywire and just sending signals everywhere. One of the treatments for it was to split it in half. It didn't hurt, so at least they had that going for it. But some odd things started happening with these patients. In these patients, sometimes you would have the left hand and the right hand disagree with each other. Say you're picking out a shirt to wear that day. Your left hand might not like that shirt. It might disagree with you. It might swat it away. Or you might be trying to drink a Coke or something. Maybe your left brain or your left hand thinks you should be drinking water instead, and it knocks it out of your hand. Pretty weird, right? Gets weirder. You could also ask each side a question independently. So technically, they're really good at multitasking. Since one side controls the left side of your vision and the other side controls the right, they're two separate visions that can't communicate with each other so that you can ask them both a question. and get answers at the same time. Another thing, you can also ask them the same question and get different answers. Like, what is your favorite color? Maybe your right side thinks your favorite color is red, and your left side thinks it's blue. Kind of strange, huh? Also, since the right side doesn't control speech, it can't talk. So you end up with situations like this. You can give a task to the right side. You can ask the person a question, and the side that speaks will tell you there's nothing going on. Like this. The right brain has a thing pop up, says mask, it picks it up. You ask the left brain what it's holding. It has no idea. It's not holding anything. Pretty weird, huh? Then, if you tell the person, hey, check out your left hand, why are you holding that? It will it will try to logic its way into a reason why you're holding it. Like for that mask, well, maybe it's part of your Halloween costume, and that's why you're holding it. There's no communication between the two sides. So where am I going with this? That's probably what you're asking right now. I don't know which side of your brain is asking that, but probably both. So we see that when the two sides can't communicate with each other, when that communication is severed, things aren't as they should be. Sure, they're manageable, but it's, you're not operating efficiently, and it doesn't mean that things are good. Both sides need to be in communication for things to go smoothly, just like we need to be in communication with God. So, let's look at the definition of communication. The imparting or exchanging of information or news, the successful conveying or sharing of ideas and feelings, or personal rapport. Now, communication is two-sided. There is an exchange. How does an exchange work? I'm telling you something that I'm doing communication, but you also have to do it by listening and retaining what I'm saying. So, it's a two-sided thing. We have examples in the Bible of lapses in communication with God. Let's look at them. So, first one that came to mind, because we just covered it in our class, Saul failing to communicate with God until it was too late. This happens in 1 Samuel, basically all the chapters. But Saul became king. At first, he was kind of godly, in God's favor. Over time, through different actions, he fell out. He stopped communicating with God. He was no longer in God's favor. And for a while, it was manageable. He was still king, still alive. But then it reached a point where he was trying to start communicating with God to get something out of God, not to have a relationship with him, but just to get something from it. And God wasn't having it. And then Saul tried to force God's hand by using a medium, and then he died. Next, kind of along that same line, you have the many examples of kings turning evil, falling away from God, no longer practicing worshiping God. They'll worship false idols, and then having the consequences because of that. You also have Jonah. Now, Jonah was in communication with God, but he wasn't doing his side of things. Or I guess you could say that he did. He listened. He just decided to do something else, which really isn't listening, especially from God. So that's a lapse in communication. Another one, the Pharisee in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. He's the one that He's praying out loud to God, praying. And it's basically him bragging, saying, oh, how good am I? I'm so great, especially compared to this tax collector. It's not explicitly said, but in that instant, he really wasn't praying. He was bragging in front of the people that was around him. That's not communication. That's not communication with God. Another one, and I included this, don't know if you can technically say it, but it was an idea I had. Paul, before he became Paul and when he was Saul. We're told that he persecuted Christians ruthlessly. He was particularly terrible in how he treated them. Did he ever ask God if that's what he wanted? I mean, he was a Pharisee, and sure, they get a bad rap, deservedly, but, they're still supposed to be religious. They're still supposed to be in communication with God, you would think. Did Paul ever ask God if this is what he wanted him to do? We're not told one way or the other, but I imagine there wasn't any communication. Then we have Adam and Eve. Obviously, God communicated with them. They listened for a little bit, but then, they kind of just did their own thing. And that's what we see a lot of this. God's been communicating with these people, more than likely. It's just that they don't do their part in listening and following. They do what they think is right and what they want. A really good example of that is Samson. So Samson, a judge, he was mighty, he was powerful, and he did some good things. But he never reached his full potential. He did a lot of things that wasn't what God wanted. He did not follow God's commandments. He decided he wanted to do what he wanted to do. Didn't consult God. But if he did, he could have wiped out the Philistine army by himself. He could have led Israel to this great nation, but he decided selfishly that he wanted to do what he thought was right and not what God knew was right. So, we have examples of lack of communication in the Bible. People not listening to God, not communicating with God until it's convenient for them. So, what can we get out of that? So, our communication with God. These examples show us how important communication with God is, how important a relationship with God is. God wants us to be in communication with him, wants us to have a relationship with him. And not just when it's convenient for us, but always. Sure, without a relationship or without communication with God, we can manage. We can get by in life without that. It's technically possible. Just like you can technically manage having your brain split in two. But you're never going to thrive with that. There's always going to be confusion. There's always going to be some disconnect with that lack of communication. So you're not going to be able to thrive without communication with God in this life, and more importantly, in the life after this one. So what are examples of this communication? Well, there's obviously prayer. Then there's Bible reading. And we have a wealth of knowledge out there, wealth of information, where we can research topics and find all that we need to know on it. I can almost guarantee you that there is a YouTube video out there on the biblical implications on a topic that you're interested in. It exists. You just have to look for it. You have to look for that exchange in information. And then there's also people that are more knowledgeable than you. Sure, we aren't all biblical scholars, but there are people that can be considered biblical scholars, or there's just people that know more than you about it. You need to lean on those resources as well in order to be able to fully get that communication with God that you need. Another thing to think about, Jesus came. Do you think that Jesus would have left if he did not do enough, did not communicate enough for what we needed? If there was something missing, he would have stayed. He would have stayed as long as it was needed for him to be able to give us the information we needed. And some of that was him teaching the disciples and them going and spreading it, but we have the Gospels and we have the rest of the Bible. That's what we need. That is God communicating with us, and we communicate to God with prayer. These are vital. They're not always easy, but it is something that is extremely important. Whether it's to make sure that we stay away from sin or just have the strength to get through the day. It's powerful. It's important. It doesn't need to be taken for granted, and it doesn't need to be taken lightly. We have the examples of what a lack of communication does. We need to make sure that we don't sever that connection. We need to do everything we can to make it as strong as possible. If you want to make that connection stronger, if you need help doing it, you can come forward as we stand and sing.